In this lesson, I want to share with you my 50 top Ableton 11 workflow tips. I recommend going through this and applying whichever ones you feel are going to work for you into your workflow. This is actually taken from my Ableton Live 11 for Beginners course, which you can check out below this video. But without further ado, let's get to those 50 tips on how to use Ableton 11 like a pro. Tip number 1. This is bringing in stems and audio files and putting them on separate tracks. I'll explain. So if we grab some audio files, and if you drag them in, it's going to put them automatically in sequence on one track. Now, if you're using Mac, you hold Command. If you're using Windows, you hold Control, whilst you're still grabbing and dragging. And it's going to, if you see there, put them on separate tracks. This makes doing remixes much faster because you can see everything's on its own track. And it's worth noting everything I say in this lesson. If you're using Windows, when I say Command, press Control. That's it. If you're using Mac, then just press Command. Okay, tip number 2. This is saving default presets for your effects and instrument plugins. And this is really useful if you often find yourself dialing in similar settings for each one. So if we drag in an EQ8 onto our MIDI channel, you can see here I've got saved in as my default a low cut off at 30 Hertz. And this is how you do it. You set up your plugin however you want to. You just right click and then you press save as default preset. And then every time you load in that effect or that instrument, it's going to have those settings dialed in as your default. Okay, tip number 3. This is similar to tip number 2, except you're doing it for the whole track. So you can save default track settings. So here we have a MIDI track. Here we have an audio track. And if you know that you're going to use the same settings or the same presets rather in each of these tracks, then you can just save that track as a default. So for instance, you might have an EQ, you might have a utility plugin, and you might want that every time that you load in an audio track. So you can just right click, save as default audio track. And then if you load in another audio track, it's going to automatically have those settings on it or those plugins on it. If you want to revert, you can just delete them, right click, and then press save as default audio track, overwrite it, and then you put it back to the factory settings. Okay, tip number 4, this is another preset saving, but instead of doing it for the instrument or the effect or the track, you're doing it for the whole project. So we can see here I've got some auxiliary channels set up. Perhaps you always know that you're going to want a bass channel with audio, perhaps you know you want something for the vocals, and you can save that as your default Ableton set. You can set up the colors, and you just go up to File, Save as default set, and then that is going to load up every time you load Ableton. Now, however, in Ableton 11, you can save various templates as well. So I've got one for my production session, I've got one for my mixing session and my mastering session. They're all separate templates, and you can just save them here and then load them in whenever you want to use them. If you want to learn more about my different sessions, then check out my Ultimate EDM mixing course to learn how to mix really truly professional sounding electronic dance music. But using templates and default sets makes it really quick to get everything in place as you want them. Okay, next tip. This is freezing tracks. So if you've got a synth and you want to share this project with another artist and they don't have that plugin, or if you've got effects on there they don't have, or if your CPU is just running high, you can freeze the tracks, and you have to do that by right clicking, pressing freeze track. And then what it's going to do is create a temporary audio file of that within your project. And then you can now listen to it, and you don't need to have this plugin. And it's going to use far less CPU. You can copy the MIDI from that frozen track to another MIDI track and use that on a different instrument. You can also copy the audio. So if you create an audio track, just grab some of your freeze track, paste it there. You've now got that audio. So it's a great way to save CPU and give you more flexibility. Next tip is customizing the aesthetics of Ableton. So I like to have it so every track that I load up is just a default by white. So then I can right click and customize the colors as I like. And the way you do that is go into preferences, go into look and feel. You can also assign track colors, turn that off. That's what I do. And you can also decide how you want the screen to look, whether you want it really light. There are a few different kind of presets in there, and you can adjust the brightness like that. You can change how deep the grid color is as well, how like contrasted it is, and just get what works well for you with your monitor, in your lighting, in your room, and use something that works really well and doesn't hurt your eyes if you use it for a long time. Next tip, again relating to the last one, is to use the zoom on the display. So you can see here I've got it zoomed in at 200%. This is so you can see what's going on. Usually when I'm producing, I'd probably have this at 130 because I don't want to hurt my eyes too much by having to strain. So this is a really, really useful tool. Next tip, super useful, is drawing a line in the velocity. So if you've got a snare roll, for instance, like this, and you want these snares to be getting louder from a quiet point, you can just drag up the velocity control here, press B to go to draw mode, then hold Option and just drag, and you'll see it's drawing a line, and when you let go, it's going to have a nice even velocity slope. Now, something to be aware of, it's very easy to sometimes miss that first snare if you are using this for snares. But now you can hear, if that velocity is assigned to the volume on your sampler, as it is by default, then you're going to get this nice steady increase in volume. Next tip, okay, so something really annoying in Ableton is if you click somewhere in a timeline and press space or play, it always starts from the beginning of the clip. And that can be really frustrating. So if you hold Option and press play, then you can play from wherever the playhead marker is. Super, super useful. Okay, tip number 10. This is using the preview button in the piano roll editor. So if this is turned off and you press any of the keys, you can't actually hear what's being played, which can be a little annoying sometimes. If you turn this on, you can. And you can even hear if it's playing a chord as well, if you grab several notes at once. Now I assign a keyboard shortcut to this. My keyboard shortcut is P, so I can just turn it on and off really quickly. And you do that by pressing Command K to open up your keyboard shortcuts, clicking on it, then pressing P, and then closing those keyboard shortcuts, and then boom, really quick, really easy. And I actually save this keyboard shortcut in my default set as well, so I don't need to be doing this every time I load a new Ableton project. Okay, next tip, really cool. If you are using a MIDI controller, like I have a keyboard here, and you're drawing in a chord or you're playing a chord, you can just hold those and then press your cursor button, right, and it's going to extend or decrease it by the amount that your grid is set to. So that's a cool way to quickly draw chords. Nice little tip there. Next tip is if you want to select all the notes in a particular line, then you can just press the button in the piano roll editor and you can see all of those notes have now been selected. Now, if you want to view the notes of several different MIDI clips at once, this is how you do it. If you're in your MIDI clip, whichever you're editing, and then you go to another MIDI clip and hold Command and left click on it, you can now see the notes in that MIDI clip as well. Now, if you want to edit some of them, but they're in the same place, so for instance, if we move these up here, so now how do I grab those notes from the blue one underneath? Well, you can click these little buttons up here, and it's going to show you which one is in focus, and then you can edit the one that's in focus. Okay, super simple one now. You can hold Command and D or Control and D in Windows to duplicate a clip. Lovely, like that. And make sure that this padlock button is either switched on if you want to not be duplicating the automation, any automation you got programmed in here. Say if we automate this, and we don't want to copy that automation, when we duplicate, then make sure this is switched to red. So we can duplicate and we'll see that automation hasn't been moved. However, if we do want to duplicate the automation, we make sure that padlock's turned off, boom, and now the automation is duplicated as well. Next tip is inserting silence. So this is really useful in Ableton, especially if you want to add some more to your track somewhere in there. So you grab the amount by which you want to insert the in silence. So let's say we want to insert that much and just press Command and I, and it's going to insert that much silence in between. Now again, make sure this padlock is turned on or off depending on what you want to do, whether you want to shift all your automation over. If you do, then make sure this is turned off, otherwise the automation will stay in the same place whilst you've inserted that silence. This is something that really did my head in when I first started using Ableton, is that if you want to do a really accurate change, it's quite hard, but if you hold Shift, you can make a more accurate change, and this works for automation nodes as well. So if you've drawn in some automation and you can see, oh, I can't get it quite right, let's drag that down. What you can do is hold Shift and then you can make smaller changes and yeah, make it more accurate. Now the next tip is actually programming in exact digits. So if you right click, you can edit value, and instead of kind of mucking around trying to get the right place, you can type in exactly what you want and it's going to go there. Okay, next tip is for automation as well. If you hold Option whilst you are dragging a line, if you see here we've got a node and then the line is highlighted. If you hold Option, you can drag that and make it a curve to make different shapes, logarithmic or exponential, in terms of your automation curves. Okay, next tip is minimizing and maximizing all the tracks at once. So if you press this little button here, this little triangle, it's going to minimize that track. If you hold Option and press it, it's going to minimize all the tracks. And conversely, if you hold it and press when they're minimized, it's going to maximize them all. Now it's worth noting that you can also grab all the tracks you want. And then if you're holding Option, you can drag and resize them all together as well. Next tip that's really useful is that you can just mute clips just by pressing 0 to mute or unmute them. Next tip is being aware of automatic track fades. So if you have a drum, like so, you obviously want that initial transient coming through. So we can see here. Now, if you've got automatic clip fades turned on, this is what happens when you load in a clip. And it kills that first transient. Now, the way you turn that off is go into Preferences and you go into Record, Warp and Launch. And then you just turn off Create Fades on Clip Edges there. I just leave that default off. Next is if you've changed your warp controls at all for a loop. Say we've changed it to this, which is weird and would sound completely dodgy, you wouldn't do this. But say you change the warp algorithm. If you want that to save, you can just press this little save button here, and then every time you load in this sample, it's going to have the exact same warp markers all loaded in place, just this little button here. Next really cool feature that is in Ableton Live 10 and 11 is that you can now stretch your audio. So if it's warped, if you've got warp turned on, and I generally recommend using Complex Pro for doing this, then you can grab and hold the end of the clip. And if you're holding Shift, it's going to stretch it like so. So you can time stretch that if you want to make sweeps longer, things like that. So now it's going to last over twice as long. Very cool tip. The next thing to note is that if you don't want to be stretching things exactly to a grid or doing anything exactly to the grid, you can hold Command and that allows you to go off the grid. You can see there we're going off the grid. And if you let go of Command, it's going to snap back to the grid. Now this is true in the piano roll editor as well. So if you want these drums to be slightly off the grid, you can just grab them, hold Command, and then you can move them slightly off the grid like so. If you want to change the size of the grid, you can hold Command and press 1 and it's going to get finer. So if we look at my grid here, and if you press Command 2, it's going to get bigger or a lower resolution. Now if you press Command and 3, it will change to triplets. So then you can attach things as triplets. If you want to learn more about triplets, then check out my Music Theory for EDM Producers course that covers all of this stuff. Next is if you've got lots of effects on a track, and you want to bypass them all at the same time instead of having to go and click on them like this. And if you've got 7, 8, 9 or 10, that can be a bit of a pain. You can just group them by grabbing all of the plugins in that channel, pressing Command G, and it's going to group them into an audio effects rack. And then you can just bypass the whole rack. And it's going to bypass all of those plugins. Now it also remembers which ones are turned off as well or turned on within that rack. Now the next one is a really essential tip. If you are using a reference track, as you should, to help you produce, whether it be the production, the mixing or the mastering, you don't want it running to your master channel because you've maybe got mastering effects on there and then your reference track's going to be being pushed through even more mastering, which is going to completely ruin the whole sound of it. So because it's already been mastered. So what you do is you select this IO button here for the routing, open that up, and then instead of having it go to master, just have it go to external out. And then you can still hear it, sounds great, and it's just not going through your master channel now. If you're finding these tips useful so far, check out my Ableton Live 11 for Beginners course below this video. And if you dig it, smash like and consider subscribing to this channel. Thank you very much. Okay, let's crack on. You probably already know what sidechain compression is. It's when you can create that pumping effect like this with the bass. Off, lights on, so the kick can pop through. But this is what I do. Some people will take the sidechain trigger from the kick itself, but if it's a longer kick, it doesn't give you so much control over the length of the pump. So what I do is I create a separate sidechain channel up here, and in this channel I've got it set to sends only, which means you never actually hear this signal. It's just being used to trigger the sidechain compressor when I use it. Now this is the sample that I use. I'll turn this to master so you can actually hear it. A very short, sharp rim shot, and that's so I can get all the control on my sidechain compression from the release and the attack knobs on the compressor. But make sure you set your sidechain channel to sends only, and that means that you'll never hear it coming out the speakers. It just is used for the sidechain trigger. A quick way to test different versions of a sound that you're trying to get right without kind of spoiling all the hard work you've done is to create different variants in chains within that instrument. So you can see here we've got a synth playing out ARP. But if we want to test some different sounds, we don't want to risk losing this one, then we can just press Command G and then open this up, and then we can just duplicate chain like this, or you can press Command D and it's going to do it too. And now you've got 3 chains all doing the same thing. But then on the second one, you could load in a different preset. Let's put a saturator on there, or a redux. And now we can preview them in situ. I'll just delete the last one because we were just using 2. And you can preview them by pressing these solo buttons. And then when you've found the one that you want, you can just delete the one that you don't want anymore. So that's a very cool way to preview different sounds without spoiling all the hard work you've already done. And I do it that way instead of just duplicating the track, which you could do, because then you've got to, okay, let's give you an example of that. If we just duplicate the track and then make the changes, then you've got to kind of switch between that one and then that one and turn them on and off, whereas this way you can just use that solo button within the chains itself and it's much quicker. Okay, the next pro tip is saving out MIDI clips. Now, if you go into your current project folder in your browser here and you say you like this ARP sound, then you can just drag the MIDI clip over into the browser and then name it as you want. Let's call it ARP sound. And then the beauty of this is you can now load this into any project or on any track. So if we do this, and it's not only going to save the MIDI information, it's also saved all of the instruments on there as well. So that's a very cool way to take an idea from one track into another track. But the beauty of Ableton is you can actually go into the browser, into the project itself, and you'll see all of the tracks that you've created in there, just like that. So I can load up any project and I can just drag these in straight away. Now the difference is this drags in the whole track as opposed to just the clip, which the first example did, but it's still really useful. The next tip is about pitch bend. So if you've got pitch bend programmed into a clip like so, and you want to be able to pitch bend more in whichever instrument you're in, make sure you go to the global section and increase the pitch bend range to what you want. I always choose 12 or 24 because that's a whole octave, and it means if you do a pitch bend right down to the bottom or the top of the clip, it's going to sound good because it's in the whole octave jump. So let's check this one out. Now the next tip was going to be how you have to reset your pitch with a little node at the beginning of each clip, because in Ableton 10 what would happen was that you maybe kind of stopped your tune and it was halfway through a pitch bend, and then when you replayed it, the instrument would still be at a weird pitch instead of back on the original pitch. So that's why I used to do this. But it seems they've actually fixed that bug in Ableton 11. So this isn't so much a tip as a you don't have to do that anymore kind of tip. Now the next tip is a personal one of mine and one I teach all my students. It's creating a utility on your master channel and then a shortcut, a keyboard shortcut, so you can switch the mono button on and off. And that is so you can check your mix in mono. really quickly and make sure it still sounds good. So what I do is if you press Command and K to open your shortcuts, press the mono button. I use Option and M just because it's close on the keyboard. It's really easy for me to reach and no other control uses that, those keys, so it's really easy for me to do. But if you want to learn more about why this is important, you can click the video that's on or around this one at the moment. A nice little quick tip for Ableton 11, if you've got your sounds or your MIDI notes and you want them to be going right up to the next one, so legato, you can just select them all and press this legato button. Much easier than kind of fiddling around trying to do each one separately. Now when it comes to groove templates, you can search through the library in Ableton Live 11, so in grooves, and you can, as you know if you watch my groove lesson, you can drag those onto different elements and it's going to apply that groove, but you can also extract groove from elements as well. So if you've got a particular vocal or a drum beat that's got a slightly different groove from the rest of your track, like this, you can actually right click on that, you can extract groove, and it's going to put it in your groove library, and then you can apply this to the different MIDI instruments as well. So we could put that on our drums, we could put that on our ARP, and then that's going to have the same groove applied to it as the audio. Next tip is being able to delay the track slightly by a matter of milliseconds or push it forward slightly. So if you've got a track that isn't quite in time with everything else, like we have this vocal here, and it's a little behind everything else, we can open up this delay button here and we can just dial in a negative amount of milliseconds. And it's going to play it slightly earlier and get it in sync with the rest of the music. Next tip is if you want to quickly toggle between the simpler in Ableton and the sampler. All you need to do is right click, and now it's automatically loaded into sampler where you've got more controls. Similarly or conversely, if you want to switch it back, you can just right click and then you're back into the simpler again. The next tip is super essential if you're using third-party plugins, which you really should be if you are producing professional music. And again, you can check out my Ultimate EDM mixing course for more info on that. But if you open the third-party plugin and then go to another track and open a third-party plugin there, then it's going to automatically close the first one. And quite often you want to see several at once on different channels. So what I do is go into Preferences, go down to Plugin Windows, and just put multiple plugin windows on, boom, and now you can open, as you would expect, multiple plugin windows at the same time. Now there are multiple ways that you can create drums in Ableton, but I prefer to use MIDI rather than audio, and this is the main reason why. So if you've got your drums like so, if you had these in audio, you'd have to go through and you'd have to swap and edit each one every time you want to change a drum sound. So you might get way through the track and realize that your kick doesn't sound quite right or your clap doesn't sound quite right. But this way, you can go into your drum rack, find your clap, if that's what you want to change. And then you can use Hot Swap and preview new samples as you go. So if we go to our drums, we can preview it in situ and then choose the best drum for it. And then if you use audio as well and you've got to kind of change the start place of the drum sound, you'd have to go through every single audio clip that you've created and change it automatically or rather manually. Whereas this way you can make any changes like to the decay, sustain and release, and it's going to change all of the instances straight away. That's why I use the drum rack for programming drums in MIDI rather than in audio. Now, not only can you hot swap out samples whilst you're listening to them in situ and preview them with the whole song, you can also do it with presets as well. So if we look at our wavetable arpeggio here, and we want to try a different preset, we can just play the track, press this hot swap button, and then click until we find a preset that we really like. Another great tip in Ableton Live 11 is that if you are using vocals and you want to warp them, Complex Pro is the best algorithm almost all the time to choose, and then you can shift the formants as well. So let me give you a quick example of what that sounds like. So we've got our normal vocals here. So to create a different effect, what we're going to do is drop the pitch down 1 octave and then play with the formants. Which creates a completely different effect for the vocals. So that's a pretty cool tip using vocals in Ableton. Next tip is dragging a piece of audio straight into the sampler or the simplet from the project itself to create your own sample. So if you create a MIDI channel and then create a simpler, like so, just drag it in. And say we want a bit of this vocal. You can drag the whole thing in, but then you've got the whole sample in there like so. And you might not want that much. So what I like to do is find the bit I want, consolidate it with Command J, and then it's created its own little sound. And now I've got that as a sampler that I can play as an instrument. There you go. The next tip is something I tell all my students, and it's super important. It's doing any volume automations using a utility plugin rather than the channel fader. So if you automate the volume on the channel fader like so, and you want to fade in this vocal, for instance. Yes, of course it's working. It's going to be fading it in. But the trouble is, if you then want to change your mix afterwards, and you think, okay, well this vocal needs to be at a higher volume or a lower volume, if you've got lots of automation on that channel, you then have to go and edit all of that automation to change the mix. And then if you want to change it back again, you've got to go back and automate all of that volume as well. So my advice is honestly leave this alone in terms of automation. Just use it manually when you need to change the mix. If you need to automate the volume, then load a utility plugin to that channel and do all your automation on this, like so. And then you've still got that volume fade. But if you need to bring those vocals up or down in the mix later, you can just do it and your automation's still working on your utility plugin. This is a super essential tip. Please, please don't be automating the volume on the channel fader. Okay, so the next tip is using the auxiliary channels for most of your reverb, most of your delay effects. This is so you can treat them as separate instruments, which means you can take out the low end of any reverbs, meaning your mix is going to be clearer, less muddy, and you can have certain elements of the mix share the same reverb, which is great for preserving CPU power, and it also just gels everything together, makes it sound like it's coming a bit more from the same space. The next tip is a bit of a wild card, but if you are creating music for video, then you can use Option, Command and V to quickly open up the video window. Just really quickly. So really useful if you're making music for adverts or you're doing it for video editing, stuff like that. Okay, next really quick workflow tip is using Z and X to zoom really quickly and zoom back out on sections. So as you know, you can grab the top bar and zoom in and out by dragging your mouse, but you can just grab a section here, press Z, boom, you zoom right in, press X, and you zoom straight out again. And my last pro tip for Ableton Live 11 is if you are exporting tracks and you want to export the stems. So let's go to the export settings here. And here you can see you can export the rendered track. So that's the entire track from the master channel. Or you can export all the individual tracks, which is great if you're sending off your tracks for remix, because it's going to save all of them as separate tracks. You can also export selected tracks only. So if you only want to export, say, the drums and the vocals, you can hold Command, select the tracks you want to export, open up the export options, selected tracks only, choose your settings here, and then press export. Okay, the next tip is with regards to warp markers. If you hold Command whilst you hover over, you'll notice that 2 appear either side of the one you're hovering over. And this means you can double click and then move that one warp marker without shifting everything else that you don't want to shift. The next tip, and this is super powerful, is if you are in session mode and using a clip, you can edit the modulation as opposed to the automation. And this means that any parameter that you edit is going to be being modulated independently of any automation and any other overriding settings. So for instance, if we choose mixer track panning, we can edit the modulation, and we've got modulation selected like this. And you can see on the track panning here, it's being modulated. But if we move the track panning, it's still going to be modulating it in relation to that track panning space. Very useful indeed for adding lots of movement into your music. There you have it, guys. I really hope you found this video useful. As I said before, this is taken from my Ableton Live 11 for Beginners course, which you can check out below this video. And if you want videos like this to help you improve your music production each and every week, do please consider subscribing to my channel because it really helps me out. And if you like this video, smash like. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, cheers and happy producing.